I'm Adam Pascarella, and welcome to episode 46 of The Power of Bold.
From New York City, it's The Power of Bold, the podcast on risk-taking, entrepreneurship, and bold living. Join us as we interview world-class performers, analyze life-changing books, and gather actionable insights to help you achieve your goals. Here's your host, Adam Pascarella.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to this latest episode of the podcast. My name is Adam Pascarella, and I'm glad that you're here and that you've been tuning in since I started this podcast in May 2017. Before I get into the content of this episode, I wanted to provide an update about this podcast. This episode, episode 46, is going to wrap up the first season of the show. I try to stick to a schedule of releasing one episode every other week, and that has worked up to a point. But having said that, my time has been more stretched recently, as I'm spending more and more of my time on investing. Because of this, I'm going to conclude this first season of the show so that I can focus on one of my true passions. Therefore, you won't be seeing any new episodes for some time. However, I definitely encourage you to listen to old episodes, especially if you haven't heard them before. My guests have provided a wealth of insights on topics ranging from marketing and storytelling to fighting fear and decision-making. Their advice truly is evergreen, and it applies to nearly everyone. So don't hesitate to go back and listen or view the transcripts on thepowerofbold.com. While I'm not exactly certain when the next season will begin, I will provide updates, so feel free to follow the podcast on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Okay. Now I'm happy to bring you my conversation with Leah Gervais. For those of you who have followed the show since the beginning, that name will likely sound familiar. Leah is not only the founder of a website called Urban 20-something, but she is also my fiance. We're actually getting married in October. I wanted to spend this episode talking about an important topic for all of us, but especially for entrepreneurs. That topic is personal branding. Leah has a deep understanding of this topic, both through her personal experience as an entrepreneur and through her work at Urban 20-something. In our discussion, Leah and I talk about personal branding for entrepreneurs, specifically what entrepreneurs can do to build and strengthen their personal brands. It's an important topic, and I'm happy that I could learn from Leah in this discussion. So let's get right to it. Here's my conversation with Leah Gervais. Leah Gervais, welcome to The Power of Bold.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, Leah, I've got to say that you are the first repeat guest on my show, which means a lot to me, and there may be some personal reasons for that, obviously, but you're also a really important and really thoughtful voice on our topic today, which is personal branding and marketing, so thanks so much for being here.
Thank you. It's an honor to be the first repeat guest.
And if you want to learn more about Leah and her background, we actually went into a pretty good amount of detail for this in episode 11, which is back on September 11th, 2017, so almost 2 years ago. I encourage you to check that out. And if you listen to that, or you know Leah from social media or her website, you know she runs Urban 20-something, and she recently launched a podcast which is called Your Biggest Vision. So can you tell the listeners a little bit about what's going on with both of those and where you see them going from here?
Yeah, so much has changed in the past year and a half, almost 2 years. My website was it was just my side hustle back then, and now it's my job. It is a 6-figure business, and my podcast has been around for about 3 or 4 months. And both of them really focus on highlighting people's transformations, typically entrepreneurs, but especially in my podcast, I really try to highlight any transformation people undergo and focus on the difficulties that come with it. And for my business, I exclusively work with entrepreneurs, actually, not just mostly, exclusively work with entrepreneurs. And I really work with people that have either established or a good idea of a platform that they want, whether that's on social media or they have a message they really want to share, and they need help understanding the back end of it. So I kind of help them build the foundation for a platform that they already have, kind of like the behind the scenes work.
Yeah, it's really awesome stuff. And you mentioned the point about transformations, and I think that's really interesting. You said it's the main area of focus for your podcast and also with your other business as well. At least from your story, you started urban 20-something several years ago, and you went full-time pretty recently with that. What is the biggest transformation that you've experienced becoming a full-time entrepreneur, and what do you think our audience can learn from that?
I think that any transformation you undergo, whether it's a health transformation or a business transformation or a personal transformation or even a relationship, I think that an incredible amount of personal development has to come with it. And I think we don't talk about that enough as a society. I think when you see entrepreneurial success stories or even weight loss, you sort of just see the actionable steps people took to get there. But the core purpose or the core reason transformations happen is because it's someone taking responsibility for their own life and deciding that they're going to change something. And even though at the end it can seem like that change might not look so radical, in the beginning it typically is a huge diversion from whatever they're doing currently with their life. And so because of that, I think that it really takes a lot of knowing oneself, staying strong in who they are, and having a lot of faith in themselves. And so of the many transformations I've gone through in the past few years with my business and my personal life and everything else, I think I didn't realize, and I wish I would have found out sooner, that so much of it, just as much, if not more of it, is internal work than it is external work and action taking.
Mm-hmm. And before people undergo those transformations, I'm assuming they want to make some change, yet it's not exactly happening the way they envision, or it's not happening at all. What are the biggest roadblocks that you see that cause people to have delayed transformations or zero transformations at all?
I often hear that people are, well, actually, I don't know if I hear this. I see that they're waiting for something, whether it's usually waiting to be ready or waiting for a sign or some sort of permission. But on my podcast, like I said, I interview people that undergo big transformations all the time. And one of the most common themes I've heard is that with anything that whenever they decide to do something different, it's never one defined moment. Like there's never one moment where you know you have to quit your 9-to-5 job, or one moment when you need to start a business, or one moment when you need to go on a diet. For them, they've all said that it's a collection of small things. And eventually they just sort of get to a tipping point, or some sort of religious epiphany happens. You know, they feel spiritual about it. And I am so grateful to be able to highlight that for my audience, because I think it really is a reminder that there is no one perfect time or one sign or anything like that. And all these people that have become very successful in their transformations can share that it was not a sign that they had, or one big moment, or one big, day that they found out they were ready. It was just a bunch of little things. And so I think when people don't move forward or don't go for a big change they want in their life, it's because they're waiting for the right time, the ideal time, the permission to do it. In other words, they're waiting for something that doesn't exist.
So if there's a listener right now that wants to become an entrepreneur, say they're in their office, their corporate job, or even if they aren't, they're in some situation that they don't really like and they want to pursue something like this full time. Your point is that you just need to pretty much just keep chipping away, keep the faith, and by implementing these tiny little steps, they essentially compound and there's a tipping point. Is that fair to say?
Well, I think that if someone is having some sort of voice in their head telling them to do something different, then you have to get disciplined about taking action toward it. And in the beginning, action is everything. I think that a lot of people get caught up on having the perfect strategy or the perfect plan or the perfect method to do something. And it doesn't matter how good your plan or your strategy is. Even if you do have a really well thought out one, things are going to change. So you have to just keep taking action. I actually don't think in the beginning that you should just take actions chipping away. I think what I meant by that was that if you're getting nudges or pushes to do something different, even if there's just a few here and there, that's the sign that you should take massive action. It's not enough to take a little bit of action. And I think with anything, whether it's weight loss or business or a relationship or anything like that, in the beginning, action is king. Yeah. And I think as you go throughout time, then you sort of start adjusting. Then you start looking at what's working. Then you start actually strategizing and being more careful. But in the beginning, it doesn't even matter how good you are, quote, at whatever you're doing, things are going to change. And honestly, if it's business related, no one's going to pay attention anyway. So you have to just take the most action that you can.
And I have to compliment you here that you are more of a deliberate action taker than I am. I'm a little bit more deliberate thinking wise, and you're biased towards taking action. So I commend you for doing for doing
we
all
balance
that.
each other out.
Yeah,
well.
exactly. For someone like me that's more deliberate and maybe hesitates to take massive action, do you have any tips on how to improve on that front, or is it more you're kind of wired this way?
I would find a mentor or a coach to help you in that situation. If action is something that doesn't necessarily come naturally to you, then you need to get someone to hold you accountable. I think that anyone should have mentors or people holding them accountable, but especially if you feel like you're struggling to know how and when to take action and it's not really happening as soon as you would like it to, then you need someone to push you, because in the beginning, that is a trait that can hurt you. Not always. It definitely, I mean, you and I have a good situation where I think we even each other out. So I don't think it's a negative trait at all, but I think if it's getting to the point where it's stopping you, the listener, from taking the action you need, then you have to get out of your own way.
Yeah, absolutely. And a mentor can keep you accountable. They can help you overcome any fears that you have. They can help you think about different solutions to overcoming those obstacles. So I definitely agree with that. So if you want to learn more about Leah's story, you can listen to episode 11, I believe it was, or go to urban20something.com. We'll have the link to that in the show notes. So that's your story, but the majority of this episode, we're going to talk about personal branding, specifically for entrepreneurs. And this is something that I think about a lot, and I think it's something that everyone can improve on, regardless of whether you're a first-time entrepreneur or you've been doing this for some time. And at least my thought process towards this is, I don't know if it's necessarily more pessimistic or anything, but I just always think that, okay, the internet and, people on the internet, whether they're promoting a product or service, it's getting a lot more competitive recently. It's more easy to start a product, a podcast, even writing a book is easier now. So there's a lot of noise out there, and everyone has to figure out a way to separate themselves and build out a niche and expand out from there. And part of that is through your personal brand, I'm assuming. What do you think about just crafting your personal brand to escape the competition? Do you have any tips or advice on that?
Yeah, so I love this topic and I love the question, because I do think that it's something that brings up a lot of fear in people right now. I talk to my clients all the time about how they are afraid to start something because they're afraid that it's already been done, or that someone else is doing it better, or that the market is too saturated, or any number of, ways that's basically telling them that unless they have something amazing or a huge competitive advantage, they're not going to last. And I didn't really think I'd become an expert in personal branding. I don't even know if I'd consider myself an expert, but I didn't really set out to become really as obsessed with this topic as I am. The way this kind of happened for me was years ago. I was one of those people that was afraid that everyone else had done things better. I was totally intimidated by the people who were really big on Instagram and had like Instagram husbands and these great photographers. And I just felt like I was at a 9-to-5 cubicle trying to figure out how I was ever going to get my name out there. So I can come to it with a lot of sympathy. And what really opened my eyes to the other way of thinking about it, the effective way of thinking about it, was reading my favorite book ever called The Science of Getting Rich by Wallace D. Wattles. And one of the main principles he teaches in the book, keep in mind this book was written over 100 years ago. So this is not about social media or branding or, whatever, a saturated market. But he talks about how there is no true such thing as competition when it comes to getting rich. And that blew me away, because I had only ever really read business books in, the sort of Gary Vaynerchuk vein that's you need to work 25 hours a day, if you want to be successful. So I thought competition was a smart business strategy, actually, looking at your, people that were in the similar niche as you and thinking about how you could be better and everything. So to read that competition is not a sustainable way to get rich I was very skeptical at first, but I was open to the idea because it was something I was aware was really holding me back and that I was really insecure about. And the concept that Wallace D. Wattles teaches in this book is that the only true way to get sustainably rich is to create, not compete. So focus on what you can create that's new instead of outdoing or doing better what's already been created. And he even explicitly uses examples like the big gas families, or people that have gotten rich on gas, like the Rockefellers and or, that were like the huge kind of, he calls them like the dinosaurs of money from back in the day, and how they did get rich temporarily on competition. That is true. But now they're rich in other ways because of what they've done with their money. It is not still necessarily because of that. So he explains it better than I am right now. But the point I'm trying to get at is focusing on competition, on creation instead of competition was really freeing to me. And the way that shows up in our modern world is by being more of yourself. No one can compete with being more of you because it's impossible to do so. And the more I marinated with this concept, the more I saw it popping up in modern day life. So for example, something that Mark Zuckerberg says to his new hires, when they do trainings at Facebook, is that early on people would ask him, how do you deal with the other social media platforms? How do you deal with your competition? How do you assess and grade Facebook against all these other platforms? And he basically just said, I don't care how other platforms are doing. I care about how we're doing. And I care about if we're doing it better than we were last month and last year. The biggest threats you'll ever have to your own success are the lack of your own growth. So anyway, this is kind of a long-winded answer to say that I think the concept of really expanding who you are, knowing more of who you are as an entrepreneur, as a CEO of a company, as anyone who's trying to stand out in a particular marketplace, even if you're not an entrepreneur, is to be more of yourself, because no one can compete with that. And then you're focusing on creating more.
Yeah, I like all of that. I guess I would just ask you, how do you truly discover who you are? I mean, it sounds like a stupid question, but I mean, do you sit down and just write out your strengths and weaknesses and your passions and interests and go from there? Or do you just maybe observe your behavior throughout the day, what you're reading, maybe websites that you're visiting? How do you actually discover who you are?
A good place to start is to really tell your story to a lot of people. And even I remember when I started doing this, I was nervous to really talk about my story because I felt like I didn't have a story. For context, where I was at that time I was 24, so I was quite young. I was also working at a nonprofit. And so a lot of the stories that we circulated or that were sort of in my world, whether through the news or through work or through my colleagues or anything else like that, were quite extreme stories. They were quite tragic. And this was also during a very intense time politically in the United States. So when people shared their stories and they seemed like they were doing amazing things, like being the founders of nonprofits or leading advocacy groups or becoming notable politicians or anything like that, or just becoming people that, were kind of in the public arena, they had usually experienced something very extreme. Like they were the victim of gun violence, or they were a woman that had overcome a lot of sexism, or they were someone that had, come from nothing. And I grew up very privileged, and I was aware of that, which I think is a good thing. I think we all need to check our privilege. But I also felt like because I hadn't really, quote, overcome something as intense as the stories that I was hearing, I didn't really have a story to tell. But what I found was that there are so many people like me. There are so many girls that can relate to even just little parts of my story and the place I was at in life right then, and the dreams I had. And I think a lot of people really appreciate the somewhat mediocre stories, honestly, or the stories that don't have this huge Hollywood arc, because that's the majority of people. And so when they feel like they're being heard and they feel like it's okay to dream bigger, it's okay to feel lost, even though you grew up privileged, it's okay to still not know who you are, even though you have, a lot of advantages, like maybe your race or your gender or your socioeconomic background, that gives them permission to question what else they could do for themselves. And I think that that's how people started relating to me. And I think that that's how I've been able to stand out, even though I didn't really have a crazy story at first. Now, I don't have a crazy story, but now I do feel like I have a bigger story to tell. I grew my business quite a bit while pretty young, but it wasn't always that way.
You said that in the beginning, when you first launched Urban 20-something and did all of this, you were feeling some fear about sharing your personal story.
Yeah.
How did you overcome that fear? Was it just the recognition that you had to do this in order to stand out? Or was there some other catalyst that forced you to act?
It was recognizing what inspired me. And I looked at what was making me dream bigger at that time. And it was, numbers on a screen or a penthouse apartment or something, some of the tangible things I had dreamed of. But more often than not, it was people and what they had done and what they had overcome and what they had accomplished. And so I just had to reflect and think, what motivates me the most? What makes me trust people the most? What helps me decide who to buy from, who to take advice from, who to motivate me? And it was the people I knew something about, or the people that were able to share that they either were like me or cared about the same things as I did, or were driven by the same values as I did. And I never would have known that if they hadn't shared their story. So I think it just made me realize that if I want to have an impact, then back at the time, I was sort of just writing about freelancing and things like that. I was going to have to be a bit deeper, and I was going to have to share more about myself than just these very, kind of cut and copy pieces of advice.
Yeah, I hear you. And you've done a great job with that, if I do say so myself.
Thank you.
You work with a lot of clients on these sort of issues. What is one of the biggest mistakes or traps that people fall into? Is it just this idea that they don't share about themselves enough, or is there something else in the personal branding universe that you see?
So you're asking if there's a mistake about kind of developing more of who they are as they build a business,
or even just sharing their story or creating their personal brand. Just because I'm just trying to picture a listener listening to this.
Yeah.
And perhaps they just started becoming an entrepreneur and they want to, carve out a niche for themselves.
Yeah.
How can they avoid common traps that you see in doing that?
Yeah. So if you're listening to this and you're thinking about my story, or if you go look at my Instagram and you see some of the things I post, I want to be clear that it wasn't always like this. And I don't want you to feel this pressure to come up with a perfect narrative or even a really sort of insightful thing you need to share. In the beginning, it is more about quantity, frankly. And I know that some people don't like that I give that advice, because a lot of people feel like they are perfectionists and they grew up with, a very carved path, and they had really good degrees and really good jobs. And I get that. So I don't want to diminish the quality of work. But I think a common pitfall could be not sharing your story, not sharing who you are, not putting yourself out there because you're waiting until you have a good image or a good brand to do so. The blunt truth is, at the beginning, most people aren't going to see what you put out there anyway. Yeah. So don't put the pressure on yourself to have a really good story arc or a really identified niche or anything like that, because it's just more important to really be consistent and put yourself out there and do it do it more than feels comfortable. And then as you gain a little bit more momentum, as you gain clarity, as you see what people respond to, as you see what people reach out to you about, that's when you can sort of shape what's really going to move the needle for me and my goals.
Yeah, it's about getting in the habit of creating and getting that real-time user feedback or audience feedback and data, which, like you said, can really help you shape your strategy down the road. So yeah. I agree with you on that.
You could drive yourself crazy if you just sit and try to think about your strategy in your own head forever.
We've tried it, or at least I've tried it. Besides you've done a great job with this. What are some of the best personal brands that you see out there, and what do they do right?
I think, I'm trying to think of some examples, but I'm just trying to think of a good variety of examples, because I want to be clear that this is a few things. One, not just for entrepreneurs. Two, not just for people that are Instagram famous or whatever. Like, it's not just all about how many followers you have. So some examples of some women I really look up to. I don't know if they're the best at personal branding or anything, but I can sort of share the range here. One that comes to mind is Nicole Lapin, who did not start out as an entrepreneur. She was an anchor woman at, I don't know exactly where.
CNBC, maybe?
Maybe. Yeah. A few different news channels. And she went out on her own and started writing and speaking when she's the first to say, had built her own name up big enough within these companies to be recognized by herself. So you don't need to start out as an entrepreneur to do that. But she was really thoughtful when she was at these jobs and at 9-to-5 jobs. I don't know if she for sure wanted to be an entrepreneur per se, or an author or anything like that. But she made sure to be careful about what she was putting out there and how she could be someone that stands out even within the umbrella of a big company. And then another person who I love so much and is probably the woman I look up to the most is Alexa Von Tobel. And she doesn't have 100,000 Instagram followers or anything like that. She was an entrepreneur and she started LearnVest. But I think what she has done really right is just made sure that she is omnipresent omnipresence, my favorite word when it comes to branding yourself. Make sure she's omnipresent in her niche. So
can you define omnipresent for people that don't know?
Yeah. So that you basically are everywhere that your ideal client or customer or audience is. And you're not just relying on them to find you, you're kind of finding them. And there's some very advanced marketing strategies you can do to make this happen. I'm not sure what these women have done that I'm bringing up. Happy to share what I do. But she did not just think, I'm going to find a financial tech company. She was really sure to write financial books, personal finance books. She did a personal finance TED Talk. She was, on some sort of entrepreneur panel at the White House during the Obama administration. So she really has done a good job of becoming the go-to person in personal finance for millennial women. So I guess the thread here from entrepreneurs and people that become entrepreneurs, or really anyone you might look up to, is that they find their niche, which you don't need to know in the beginning. I don't want anyone to get that confused. They find their niche and they make sure that they expand upon it in more ways than just their job, but they really try to be seen on multiple platforms within that so that you can build your expertise.
Yeah, those are great examples, and I'll link to some of their stories in the show notes as well. And for your point about being on different platforms, one of them obviously is social media.
Yeah.
Is it possible to build a personal brand, an effective personal brand, without being on social media, or is it a requirement now?
I think it's possible, but I'm not sure why you wouldn't. I mean, if it's sort of like, why make things harder for yourself? I know some people don't like social media, but you can outsource it. I really don't think I think people make social media harder than it needs to be. There's so many different options for ways that you can still have things going, even when you're not the one doing it. You can use planning or scheduling tools so things are posted when you aren't manually doing it. You can hire other people for not all that much money on various freelance websites to manage it for you. And I don't think you need to have hundreds of thousands or millions or any type of following to really build up your platform. And in fact, I think there are a lot of benefits to having under 100,000 followers on a platform like Instagram.
Why?
If you're an entrepreneur, then you're more accessible to other entrepreneurs. And I know for my podcast, one of the ways I get most of my guests is by reaching out to them. And if they have over 100,000 people, I'm not going to. Yeah. I'm going to see if I can email them or something like that. But I don't trust that they're the one handling their own inbox anymore. I don't trust that my message is going to get through to them when they probably have so many others coming in. Maybe these are false assumptions that I'm making, but for the most part, I have found that I've gotten the attention of people that they're called micro influencers if they have between 10 and 100,000 followers. Much easier if they're in that range. So yes, I do think you can build one. No, I don't think it's a good idea to try.
Yeah, right.
And I also think it's really key to treat social media as a means to a bigger database and not as the means to an end.
Mm-hmm. And right. So if you don't inherently like social media or don't have time, you can always outsource this. And by outsourcing, you're saying not only having someone maybe manage how often you're tweeting or posting, but even replying to your fans or followers. Is that right? How exactly are you outsourcing it?
Sure. I mean, you can do it in whatever way you need to. One thing I will say is I do always suggest to my clients that they don't spend more than 45 minutes a day on direct messages. I have someone that helps me with my social media just in order to keep it, relatively normal, but I still answer all my messages and I still answer all my comments. If you just don't want to be on it every day, especially in the beginning, and you feel like it's sucking up your time, then I would check out an app like Buffer or Planoly, or I think it's called. I'll be clear that I've never used any of these. I used Buffer for Twitter once upon a time, but I have clients that do, and it will just post to Instagram for you. That's a great option if you have under 10,000 followers and you're trying to post 2 or 3 times a day and you just don't want to be doing it manually.
Yeah, it's all good stuff. And along with social media, there's also email marketing, which I think, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you may find just as effective or even more effective than social media. Is that right?
For sales, yes.
For sales, yeah.
Far more than social media for sales.
What about on the personal branding front?
I think for me, it has been, maybe not more, but just as much. I don't know that is how it's going to work for everyone. And there's kind of a lot to my reasoning for that. I think some people would say that that email has, that it's not as big as it was. I think for sales, that's not true. I think the statistics only show that more people are still buying from their email than they are buying from things on Facebook or Instagram. Overall, I think email open rates may be going down a little bit, but I'm not so concerned with how many people are reading my emails. I'm concerned with the ones that are and the fact that they're being nurtured very well. When people sign up for something with me, they'll tell me that they've been reading my emails for months, if not years, some of the time. And I know that in the past, when I've made very big investments, the biggest investments I've made in my business, I have often gone into the email archives of some people and read what they've done for the past several years. And it goes back to the reason we started this conversation, which is that I want to know that they were once in a place I was, and that I can trust that they made the same sort of transformation that I am trying to do. And you can't really know that if you only see them at the end spot. I guess you can go back in social media, stalk someone, or kind of just ask them, and that's all fine. But I have found email to be the most intimate and effective way to build true relationships with people.
Mm-hmm. And by email, you're talking about just a regular, frequent newsletter, or are you even just a blog post within an email? What exactly are you talking about?
So the way I teach email marketing, which I'll be clear is very specifically for entrepreneurs that sell something that you can buy online, that doesn't need to be an e-course per se. It also doesn't need to be only service-based, but often not brick and mortar. Sometimes brick and mortar, not usually. So anyone that's running a business by themselves, a blog, or is a small business online that sells something on there, then I cannot recommend applying email marketing enough. And in the course that I have, Limitless List is what it's called, which I don't know why I named it that, because I can never say it out loud. It sounded so cute when I typed it, and now every time I'm like, this. I teach that you should send 3 categories of emails. The first is just a value email. So the way that most often manifests is in a weekly newsletter. In this, you're just sharing with your audience what's new with you, what's new with your business, what's new with how you can help them, what new value you might have for them. In other words, it's not a sales email, and it's a way to really give them a glimpse into what you're doing and who you are, and telling more of your story, and not just being a generic business that is an icon or a logo or whatever. The other is an engagement email, which is a call to action for someone to email you back. This is really effective if you're a coach or a consultant, or if you are in any sort of agency, any service-based platform where you're just trying to get to know your clients more and find out what they need, or your audience more. Sending them an engagement email so that they reply to you will work really well. And then the final type of email you can send is a pure sales email, where you advertise something that you have. Maybe you put it on sale. Maybe there's a new upgrade to it, or a new improvement, or a reason they should buy it now, something like that, and hope that they buy it right then.
Mm-hmm. No, it's all good stuff. So if I'm an entrepreneur, I'm trying to build up my personal brand as a thought leader in some industry, the call to action would be, hey, download my product or book, or some digital product. That's probably the easiest way to do it. Is that right?
Yes. The most effective way is to have a free piece of content in exchange for their email address. Yeah. And when it comes to social media, I would recommend at least once a week directing your audience to that opt-in. I think people get so tripped up in thinking that social media is about making sales, or about telling people about your offering and reaching out to people to see if they would be a good fit for you as a client. No one wants to get a message on Instagram that says, will you buy this from me? They just don't. I don't. And right. I'm in this work, and I would never do that. So I think some people get a little bit annoyed at first with me, because they're like, oh my God, that's so much extra work. I just want to sell. I don't want to create something new and send them an email and blah, blah, blah. And I get that. But when you do it this way, you're leading with value. You're showing that you know what you're talking about. You're not being salesy. You're not being pushy. You're actually being very generous. And that's just better overall. Yeah. And it also gets rid, just today I talked to someone who said that she's so sick of feeling salesy. Well, then don't sell at first. Right. Give something away for free, and then it comes more organically. And
educate the follower or listener and go from there. Right. Yeah. Do you have any, we talked about social media and email predominantly here. There are other methods as well. But do you have any insight into like the future of social media and email marketing in relation to personal branding? That's kind of a abstract question, but do you see any trends out there when you're interacting with your clients or reading about this stuff that's going to be interesting in the future?
I'm not as social media fluent, I guess, as I might sound. I am way more obsessed with email marketing. So I think I talked a lot about social media here, but I'm not an influencer per se. So I think a lot of people see people that are really big on Instagram predominantly, and they see them working with brands, and maybe they're traveling, and they have partnerships with brands. And I don't really do that. So I think that that's sort of more of the leader or the sort of lead niche on social media. And I don't know the future of that kind of zone so much. What I do think is that personal branding is only going to get more important, and being more of who you are is only going to be more of an effective strategy. And if you think personal development and self-reflection and journaling has nothing to do with your success as an entrepreneur, you're wrong. And it's really important to make sure that you are in touch with who you're becoming on this journey so that you can inspire other people to do the same.
It's all good stuff. Just keep paying attention to your personal brand. So keep going forward. So just to wrap up here, a few quick questions. One question I always ask my guests is one thing that listeners can do right after they listen to this episode to implement some of the things you talked about. So I'll ask you the same question. What can they do right after listening that can help them either start building up or continue building up their personal brand?
Do your guests know we're getting married?
What's that?
Do they know we're getting married?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I didn't know. I just thought of that.
No, that's cool.
My advice would be after this, so I'm not sure when you're going to air this, but
in the next couple days.
In the next couple days. Okay, so it's the beginning of the month. Sit down and double down on plans that you have to grow whatever it is that you have on your heart. So if you are an entrepreneur, or if you're thinking of starting something, or you're thinking of writing a book or starting a podcast or anything like that, go sit down and double down on the amount of content you can put out pertaining to what your goal is right now. And it's going to feel uncomfortable, and it's going to feel weird, and it's going to feel like you're annoying people, and you might be, but it doesn't matter. The more you can do in the beginning, the more, like you said, the more of a habit you'll get in, and the more you'll learn about what people are responding to and what they're not. So I think my biggest piece of action would be to push yourself to take more action right now. Right.
And I kind of wish I titled this podcast The Power of Action instead of The Power of Bull. I mean, they're kind of the same thing, but You're right. It's all about action. It's all about taking massive action if necessary, but also calculated massive action. You don't want to be reckless, would you say?
Yeah, I would say, but I do think in the beginning people are over-calculated.
Yeah.
And so it actually err on not reckless, but I just want to share an example because I think it's so powerful. A woman who I'm friends with and I interviewed on my podcast is a travel influencer. She has over 100,000 followers on Instagram, and she truly travels full time. Like, the people she works with are either the tourism chambers of countries or swimsuit companies. So she's like done a great job curating that. And she has this really beautiful feed, lots of drone shots. She lives in Bali. You know, it's always like her on the beach or in a pool or eating like a coconut. It's amazing. And I think people see this and they think, wow, well, I need to have a beach and a great camera and, you know, all these extreme locations that she has and a beautiful body and she's young and all that in order to have that kind of success. But she shares that for her first 10,000 followers, so, you know, that's like the hardest to get, she did not post one single picture of herself. She posted 3 times a day, reposting pictures from beautiful locations that other people on Instagram posted while she sat in her over air-conditioned office on Wall Street in New York. So she didn't travel at all. Nothing was of her. Nothing was her own photography, nothing. And the reason I share that is because in the beginning, she just needed to get things out there and she didn't have her own content. So she used others and she would message them and try to get to know them and build relationships with them. And then they helped her. She was really smart about it. So think about that is such a good example of not waiting until you're ready or the perfect time or until you have a $5,000 camera and an Instagram husband or whatever. You know, she found a workaround. She thought, I need to get as much content out there as I can. And she did it. And now all of it's archived and you'd never even know. Yeah. So the point is, don't get tripped up on having things perfect because it is important to take more massive action. And I think even then, maybe I even would have given her the advice, like, don't build a brand around other people. Put pictures of yourself, even if they're not that good. And I totally would have been wrong. So you have to take bigger action.
Well, it shows there's more than one way of doing this too.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Cool. Well, and second to last question, have you read any good books lately? I know you mentioned The Science of Getting Rich, but is there anything else related to this topic or anything about entrepreneurship that's really been insightful?
This is very New Age spiritual, so it's not very practical, but I'm just rereading Ask and It Is Given by Abraham Hicks, and it's very inspiring. So if you do want to focus more on the personal development, then that might be interesting.
Cool. I don't know that one.
Yeah. It's a bit out there. I would try to get a little more familiar with Abraham Hicks first because they've written several books. And I think that that's a little bit one later on. And some of the language is very specific to them. So I would maybe watch some of their YouTube videos first. And another one that I think is great for entrepreneurship or any transformation that I come to again and again is The Big Leap by Gay Hendricks.
Excellent. Those will be in the show notes. Well, Leah, thank you so much again for being a repeat guest on The Power of Bold. If any listeners want to learn more about you or your podcast or your website, where can they go?
You can find me at urban20something.com, the number 20, not spelled out. And on Instagram, I'm at urban20something. And I do a live podcast recording every Monday morning on Facebook Live. It's just facebook.com/urban20something. And my podcast is called the Your Biggest Vision Show.
Your Biggest Vision. Go check it out. Well, thanks, Leah. This has been awesome. And can't wait to get married to you in about 5 months.
Me too. Thanks for having me.
Thanks again to my guest, Leah Gervais, the founder of Urban 20-something, host of the Your Biggest Vision podcast, and my fiance. Like I said at the beginning of this episode, this is the final episode of this season. I want to thank all of you for tuning in and for being part of the Power of Bold community. We've learned quite a bit along the way, so if you want to go back and listen to older episodes, I encourage you to do so. I'm going to do it myself, and I hope you do the same. In the meantime, you can always get in touch with me through email or Twitter. Email me at adam@thepowerofbold.com or follow me on Twitter at @apascar. I like hearing from my listeners, so don't hesitate to get in touch with me, whether it's about the show, a problem you're facing in leaving your day job to try something different, or anything else. So that's it for this episode of The Power of Bold. Take care.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Power of Bold. For show notes and a transcript of this episode, visit thepowerofbold.com. Feel free to get in touch by visiting our Facebook and Twitter pages. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes or Google Play. We'll see you next time.